Well, I know we have a really full agenda today, and I think Steve Marks might just be jumping in a few minutes late, but I do want to keep us on schedule. So I'm going to recommend that we go ahead and just start as we generally do with our introductions and opening comments. And I will go ahead and start, and then I'll just kind of call by first name for our board members, and then the names that I see on the screen, and that'll just kind of facilitate us all talking over the top of each other. So my name's Laura Anderson. I am I'm a member of the Oregon Ocean Science Trust and the director or chair of your meeting today. And we have with us Senator Anderson.
Good morning, good afternoon. Good to see you all.
And Representative Gomberg.
Hi, everybody. David Gomberg, Trust Board Member. Nice to be with you again.
Dina.
Good afternoon, Christina Volniakovsky. I'm an Oregon Ocean Science Trust Board Member.
Shelby.
Hi, everyone. Shelby Walker, I'm board member.
Steve.
Hi, everybody. Steve Marks, board member.
And we also have for our agenda today, we have Jack Barth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jack Barth from Oregon State and talking about the OAH Council.
And Karin.
Good afternoon. This is Karin Brady. I am with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife Marine Resources Program. Happy to be with you today.
And also on our agenda today is Tom Calvanese. I'll give Tom a more thorough introduction before he presents.
Hi, everybody. It's Tom Calvanese here in Port Orford. I am the station manager for the Port Orford Field Station, and you'll hear other things that I do down here in Port Orford later. Thanks so much for inviting me to present, and I'm looking forward to sharing about all the cool things going on down here on the South Coast.
And then I see three names that I recognize. We have Kristen. Are you available to introduce yourself? There you go. I cannot hear you, but I don't see a mute symbol on your computer either, but I can't hear. Kristen Dawn is the Marine Reserves Program Coordinator. That may or may not be the most accurate description for ODF and W. Hopefully she can get her audio on. And Dick Vanderschaff, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Dick Vanderschaff. I'm with the Nature Conservancy and a program manager in the Marine program.
And we have Richard Hildreth. And you're on mute, sir.
Anyway, retired director of the University of Oregon Ocean and Coastal Law Center. I have worked on and off throughout my career before retirement, a lot of Oregon Sea Grant support, and I am now looking around for opportunities. So I'm so glad I'm on this listserv.
Fantastic. We're glad to have you here. Thank you for joining us. And staff, we have Andrea, Lonnie, and Edward. Ted, could you introduce yourselves, please?
Sure, this is Lonnie Amadian, and I'm here to do administrative support for the youth today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Andrea Celentano. I'm a policy and legislative analyst with the Oregon Department of State Lands, and I help to advise the OOST, and I'm here to also to provide administrative support.
I'm Ted Bright with DSLIT. I'm just here for technical support for the meeting.
And we have Andy Lanier jumping in. Andy, it looks like he's still connecting. That would be all the boxes I have in front of us today. Andy, you can introduce yourself when you're able to. And we have a really full agenda today and lots of exciting topics to talk about. I do want to note that for members, you probably just received an email from Lonnie, and that's a presentation copy from our last meeting. So you don't need that for today. That was an oversight as I was preparing for this meeting. I recognized that I had failed to forward Lisa Gaines' presentation from our last meeting. So that's not needed for today. That's just for your background. And we also, so for our meeting today, we're gonna get a legislative update. We're gonna talk about next steps in coordination with the OAO Council. We're gonna take a break after that. We're gonna have a great presentation from Tom Calvanese about several initiatives on the South Coast. We'll make sure we have public comment at 2:40. And then for member updates and other business, at a minimum, I'll be asking Shelby to give us an update on the Marine Reserves Assessment RFP process. We'll talk a little bit about our board vacancy. I'll give you an update on a conversation I had with Congresswoman Bonamici's office about some ocean initiatives there, and we'll make some plans for our next meeting. So for the next 2 hours and 50 minutes, here we go. The meeting summary was circulated by Lonnie this morning. Have the board members had a chance to review that summary for the April 7th meeting?
Yes.
Are there any corrections to or comments regarding the summary?
I didn't have any comments.
Great. I would entertain a motion to approve the summary of the April 7th, 2021 meeting of the Oregon Ocean Science Trust.
So moved.
Seconded.
Second, great. And all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? I think that was everyone. Great. Looks like we have approved that. I'd like to move into the Oregon legislative update of the last session. So much happened, and we have our senator and representative here to hopefully give us some insight into how the session went. And I think we all know that HB 3114 is on our agenda today, and for good reason. I want to thank you both for championing that bill through the session, and I think we're really excited to get moving on some of the science initiatives here. But perhaps Representative Gomberg, could I start with you to give us more insider information on the session?
Goodness. The session. Well, it was a session like we've never seen before. I mean, going into it in the midst of the pandemic, the building was closed. We came out of the wildfire season. I'll remind people that last Labor Day, we had more acres on fire in Oregon than during the entire 10-year period of what we call the Tillamook burn. So that was devastating. And we had the challenges of trying to operate the legislature for the most part remotely. As we're doing this meeting remotely, we had freezes and frosts, and we had heat waves. So other than that, we dealt with major budget challenges. We started the session believing that the budget was in a free fall. People weren't working, so they weren't paying income taxes. Businesses are closed and not paying corporate taxes. Restaurants and taverns are closed. We're not even selling lottery tickets. But by the end of the session with the final economic forecast, we saw that the Oregon economy was rebounding remarkably so, and that we had not only the dollars to cover our current operating expenses, but that many dollars were going to be going into an Oregon kicker and returning a lot of that money to Oregon taxpayers next year. On top of that, we received about $2.6 billion from the federal government that came with strings attached. Most of those dollars were intended for one-time expenditures. But you are seeing infrastructure investments across Oregon and particularly across the Oregon coast. I think the coast did particularly well, and we did so because legislators from the coast worked together. Senators and representatives, Democrats and Republicans coordinating, cooperating, taking care of the district, excuse me, which I would say is the way it should be. So there were a number of policy bills that went forward, but I think at when history looks back on this session, they're going to say it was mostly about the money. I'm going to pause at this point rather than steal all the thunder and see if Senator Anderson would like to add anything, and then I think we'd both be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Representative Gomberg, and I would echo everything you've said. And for me, as you all know, I have nothing to compare to. This was my first session. So I'm told by representative and others that, it only can get better from here. So, I'm looking forward to that. And I also throw out compliments to even this meeting. I think we've learned a lot about virtual meetings and being able to execute them with efficiency. And Laura, you've certainly got a big crowd. I don't know in your past meetings if you've had this kind of attendance when you meet in person, but it's impressive. And I think for me, the representative has indicated certainly some big budget issues. Dollars were spent. I would say sometimes I felt irresponsibly or rushed, not thoroughly thought out. And for that, it only means we'll be dealing with it the next biennium. We added a lot of people, a lot of FTE to agencies and programs. And fortunately or unfortunately, those programs and people expect to remain in place and continue on. And that all has a revenue impact. But I was very pleased. I think, again, the representative touched on, I continue to be impressed with the Coastal Caucus, the way it works together. We met weekly, talked about, bills on the table coming through, things that were impacting or potentially impacting the coast. And it very, I can't emphasize it enough, what a cooperative environment it is. And, I wish all political settings could be that way, but it just proves that, we can get things done when we work together. So I'm pleased with House Bill 3114 getting through. I know you've struggled with that in the past. Timing is everything. And, I made a comment to a reporter that, even the change on the table was spent. I'm glad that we could get money in this case back to the trust. So what might you be interested in?
Great. Do any of the members have questions regarding the session?
Well, we've set for a special session in September for redistricting, so that should be, exciting. And typically, as you know, legislative days, throughout and before the next short session. But I'm unfamiliar with what kind of when work assignments or special task force come out, Representative Gomberg. But I assume if we're good boys and girls, we get assigned to these special tasks of joy and excitement.
Absolutely. That's why they put us on the Ocean Science Trust. I know that the chair has a number of projects that she was planning to delegate to you, and I'm looking forward to seeing that list.
Great, let's get to work to find out what those steps are. And I just want to also recognize people on this call. And if you, looks like we were joined by several people since we did introductions, but shepherding this House Bill 3114, we had a lot of support from Senator Anderson and Gomberg, but there was some a lot of work that had to happen with the rest of the legislature. And for me in particular, Charlie Plyben was really instrumental in keeping me informed of what was happening in Salem and telling me like where to direct my efforts for lobbying. And we also had a lot of work done by Jack Barth and Karen Braby, Francis Chan, Katie Fast, and Elizabeth Perotti were really involved. And from TNC, Gina Carter and Amelia Porterfield were also really involved in keeping that bill moving through. And I just want to recognize that joint effort that we're all working together for Oregon Ocean Science. And now we have some work to do. I also want to recognize tangential to us, there was also a really good outcome for the Oregon Conservation and Recreation Fund, which I believe had $1 million in general fund, which was restored, as well as $1 million from federal funds from the American Rescue Plan Act to support their efforts. And so that's great news for the Oregon Conservation Recreation Fund, of which we're receiving some support for the Marine Reserves Assessment. I think for the next roughly, well, we'll see how long it takes, but we have about an hour if needed. I really want to have just a dialogue with Karen Braby and Jack Barth, as they are the co-chairs of the Ocean Acidification Hypoxia Council. And we are bound together now through HB 3114 to work together, to coordinate together, to make sure that the roughly $1 million, a little more than $1 million, is spent with the intention and integrity that it was meant to. So with that, Karen, Jack, would one of you like to kind of start us off in this direction from the OAOH Council perspective?
Absolutely, and we'll do this. We haven't coordinated on how we'll trade off, so I think we'll just go ahead and take turns. But I'll start by putting words in Jack's mouth that we are thrilled to be here and to be bound to the Ocean Science Trust through House Bill 3114. And Senator Anderson and Representative Gomberg, thank you for championing this. I'll repeat Laura's thanks. And this is the third and finally successful session for this bill and the projects therein. And so I'll leave that as my introduction. I've turned off my video because I am still working at home on limited bandwidth. So I've turned my video off, but I turn now to Jack to introduce himself, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Karen. I'll just give my thanks too, especially to the Coastal Caucus for keeping this going and alive for the many years. And we on the OAH Council have been doing our work to produce a number of reports year after year. And it's so exciting to hear that we've been listened to out there, right? We put the reports in and now something's coming back the other way for all of Oregon. So thank you, Representative Gomberg, Senator Anderson, and all the others. thanks, Charlie, for keeping us all informed. So I think what we might do next, and Laura said it exactly, is what kind of process to match the legislative intent and do the best we can. So we could start going through the details and how it matches up to, say, the OAH Council action plan. So I'll just pause and see if Karen wants to bounce off that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. I don't have a formal presentation. You all know us and you know this work, and so I didn't want to have a formal presentation, but rather we might use a spreadsheet that we've put together that summarizes the bill. I think that there are a lot of questions about how the trust will take this handoff and redistribute funds through competitive process. So we'd love to be part of that discussion. And maybe I can start with just a reminder of where all of these resources are on the web. So if it's okay, Laura, I'd like to go ahead and share my screen.
Yeah, Lonnie, do we need, or Ted, do we need to give access to Karen for that, or can she just click the button? Oh, there it goes.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so here is the OAH Council website. We have a very out-of-date picture at this point of the council members, but this website is hosted for all of Oregon ocean issues by DLCD. So Andy Lanier, who's on, is the master of this website, but it includes information about the territorial sea plan, marine reserves, ocean acidification, and so on. OPAC, very importantly. And so here we have a portal where you have access to all of our reports and so on. Of particular note, in the last year, we finalized our 2020 biennial report to the legislature. That report is here. So there's some appendices here. And then if you scroll further down, you get to the actual report. And then more recently this year, we filed this multi-agency report. And I'm taking time to point these out for a couple of reasons. One is that all of the reports that we have put together and posted here follow very similar themes. And those themes are science and monitoring. The second one is mitigating the effects of ocean change and ocean acidification. The third theme is adaptation and resilience. The fourth theme is awareness, public awareness, general awareness about the issues. And the fifth one is the governance aspect, or the institutions, the policies that we can put in place to help us face these changing conditions and successfully navigate them. So this OAH multi-agency report is one report that, like the others, follows these 5 themes, but also is a little bit of an insight into each of 8 agencies, including Department of State Lands, on how the agencies connect to the issue of ocean change, programs that are already in place, aspirations for future programs and needs, and really provides good insight into the agency foundation or structure that Oregon already has in place for dealing with some challenging issues around ocean change. So I'm not going to go into that anymore, but the same types of projects that are highlighted in that agency report are highlighted in the bill, are highlighted in the 2020 biennial report to the legislature. And so you'll see these repeating themes and repeating identification of high priority items from the OAH Council, which is the body that the legislature put together to bring these types of recommendations and priorities up to the forefront for the state. So with that, I'll pause again. I can go through the bill projects, Laura, if that would be helpful, and or we can start talking about process on how to move these funds into the field and get the boots on the ground working. So do you have a preference, Laura?
Yeah, let me go ahead and take, why don't you go ahead and stop your screen share, Karin? And it probably would be useful for the members to just, I can pop up on my screen share the bill language relative to the OOST. So I'm gonna go ahead and see if I can share that here. So we have the section 1 of the bill here, which directs $1,060,000 to be expended by the OOST in consultation with the council. There's 100, and this is in the form of competitive grants. That's very important. There's 100,000 for intertidal ocean acidification and hypoxia monitoring at Oregon marine reserves. There's 300,000 for subtidal ocean acidification hypoxia monitoring at marine reserves, 100,000 for OAH monitoring at Yaquina Bay, 140,000 for ecosystem modeling of submerged aquatic vegetation, 25,000 for developing recommendations through workshops or seminars for maximizing the abundance of wild shellfish, cultured shellfish, and submerged aquatic vegetation in estuaries, 150,000 to develop best management practices for shellfish cultivation that protects or promotes estuarine health, 180,000 for a study on the life cycle impacts of OAOH on shellfish species that are important to Oregon, and 65,000 to develop a communications plan and strategy for outreach and education on OAOH impacts, science, and solutions. And I wanted to read through that so that we all recognize the complexity of what we are about to undertake. There are a lot of different expectations on how we're going to co-manage these funds. So that said, understanding what our respective roles and responsibilities are, we're probably not going to figure all of that out in the next 45 minutes, but what I'd like to be able to do is at least find out what are the relevant questions. If we're unclear on what our roles and responsibilities are, then those are things that we can look at and come back to in a subsequent meeting. So that said, running a competitive grants process for that number of different, there are 8 different line items in the bill. Just recognizing from the OOST perspective that we don't currently have the capacity as an entity to do that ourselves. We're excited about figuring out how we're gonna either partner with another entity, subcontract that, or develop the capacity ourselves for being able to run the competitive grants process. But I think what's really kind of important is just understanding we have the fiscal responsibility of taking the money in and putting the money out, but the OAOH Council really has the expertise in knowing how to best use those funds in the interest of the state. They can use their body to direct that. So I guess I'll kind of put this discussion point back to Karin and Jack and ask, does that sound like a good starting point for a conversation. Is there anything I said that doesn't necessarily jive with your thinking or otherwise?
I'll
I think
just
you're.
say, go ahead,
ahead,
Karen.
All right, Jack, you first.
All right. Thanks, Laura. I'll just say that, even with the 8 line items that Laura read, there's a lot in between the lines there too, right? And part of that is the OAH Council documents back up, the reason for some of those line items, as well as and Karen can address this, the Shellfish Task Force. So there is quite a bit of behind the scenes stuff that we can use to make sure we point things in the right directions. But I couldn't agree more, Laura, that you guys, the OOST, have the authority to do this, and we're available to consult to inform the best choices.
Yeah, I'll just underscore that. I think that the evolution of the ideas behind these projects has been pretty significant, not in terms of the content of the projects, but the handoff from entity to entity. And so, we all know the recent history of ocean acidification and hypoxia in Oregon, starting with the oyster industry. And it was really the Coastal Caucus championing that with Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery that generated a lot of the West Coast action around this issue. And so the Shellfish Task Force that Jack mentioned was very significant in developing some of the priority items that are in the bill, as well as a number of items that have come in since that time. The task force was convened in, I think, 2014-15. And so it's really kind of carrying forward these ideas from that original Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery emergency all the way through the Nearshore Research Task Force that developed the Ocean Science Trust, through the Shellfish Task Force, and now the OAH Council and House Bill 3114. So there's a lot of connectivity there. We all have different perspectives on it. And I think the council, you're right, has some folks who have that historical perspective to share with the competitive grants process, and some of the scientific expertise to bring to the table as well, to make sure that the funds are spent effectively and efficiently. But you guys are the ones who will rely on to get the logistics done to get the grants process in place and get the money out there.
Laura, I'll just add very quickly, there's a matter of timing too that we ought to talk about. Us ocean-going observationalists, want to be ready for, I would think, next field season.
And Jack, what is next field season for those of us who are not ocean-going observing scientists?
Well, I'm a little bit biased because these things take vessels. So when we can go out in the spring of next year.
Okay.
But there are certainly other activities that could be done before then. But I guess for me, it's just, we don't want to take a long time plotting this all out. Let's figure out how to get it done.
Absolutely. And in the interest of that, I want to open it up momentarily for some questions from our members. And I'd like to ask Shelby Walker specifically, because of her expertise in running competitive grant programs, what thoughts she might have about how we could proceed. But in advance of doing that, I wanted to ask if Andrea from DSL could just give us a little bit of perspective from the department standpoint. Andrea and I spoke briefly via email just about the pathways for financing and how this might be different from the way that we're currently working with Oregon Community Foundation, for example, where we have private funds that are being moved. This is public funds, so it's a little bit different. So Andrea, could you give us a little bit of background?
Definitely. So just to speak to that just a little bit, it seems like a very long time ago, but last year we went through a whole exercise of writing rules to establish how the OOST might go through a competitive grant process. So we do have that within Division 141 that is housed by the Department of State Lands. So you guys did set up a process for administering a competitive grant process. Within those rules, it does say that you have the option to contract with a third-party administrator, such as the Oregon Community Foundation. However, in speaking with DOJ and having some internal conversations with the agency, because this is new to us as well, this is the first time that the OOST has received a general fund appropriation, so it is very exciting, but we do have to figure out how, I guess, functionally we have to administer that based on the way the fund was set up within the legislature and the nature of the appropriation. And based on those conversations, we believe that the funds need to stay within the OOST, within the treasurer, because they are general fund appropriation, and the appropriation was given to DSL as opposed to transferring those funds to the Oregon Community Foundation. So depending on your agreement, and I apologize, I do not know if this is outlined in the way that the Oregon Community Foundation agreement was set up, I believe they could have a role in administering like the RFPs and the grant selection process, but at the end of the day, DSL would need to be the one that actually distributed those funds and made sure that we were in compliance with legislative intent and that all the boxes were checked, as opposed to simply like passing all of those funds to the Oregon Community Foundation to pay out. So I think that we could have some sort of a dual process if that's the way that the OOST wanted to move forward. Or I believe that you guys, based on the rules that were created last year, could design and develop and implement your own RFP process to decide those awardings on your own. And then DSL could still be the one to administer and manage the actual contracts that go along with those grants. Is that helpful, Laura? Is there something else that you wanted me to?
No, that's really helpful because we have options, you know, here. And so looking at what those options are important. But what I'm gathering is that it would not be necessarily an option to move all these funds to OCF and to run it through that we want to maintain those funds within the Treasury, and we'll work through DSL administrative pathways to expend funds. Is that correct? Kind of a nutshell.
I believe so. I only had one conversation with DOJ, and that was the initial interpretation. If that's something that you guys really want to pursue, we could have some additional conversations and maybe look more detailed in at the legislative intent around the bill. But from an initial reading, DOJ advised that DSL was likely the entity that needed to expend that appropriation and those funds. Again, you guys could partner for all of the front end work that the OOST doesn't necessarily have capacity to do. And there is within the rules the ability to pay administrative costs in order to run that type of a program to a third-party administrator. Or you guys could absolutely use the rules that were created to do it yourselves. So it just kind of depends on what you guys, how you guys want to move forward.
Yeah, so with that knowledge, that's some good background. I'd love to have a conversation with our board about what kind of questions we might have about proceeding, what options we might see. I might ask Shelby if she'll jump in here because Sea Grant is a competitive grant organization. She has a lot of experience with this. And so Shelby, can you maybe give us some of your insight?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. So I have lots of questions. Andrea, is it possible for you to put in the chat the rule for the competitive grants?
Yes,
the rule?
Absolutely.
Because it's been a little while, so I'm not recalling the specifics exactly, even though I remember being part of the process. So with respect to the funding that's available, I'm assuming it's operating on the duration of the biennium. So we have these funds that are intended to be expended over the next 2 years period. Is that correct?
I don't want to give you a definitive answer because I want to double check, but I believe that the funds, the way that the fund was created is that those funds are continually appropriated to the OOST. So I don't think that it is necessarily limited to the biennium, but I will double check that but I'm pretty sure when I looked at it last week, that was how I read that.
But the funds currently are for now for the biennium, potentially to continue.
Yes. I am not an accountant, so I just want to put that out there. However, there are differences in the way that different funds can be set up. In some funds are like use it or lose it. In some funds, you have to go back and ask for legislative permission to spend after a certain date and things like that. But I believe that the OOST is continually appropriated. So I believe once the funds are in there, there are not hoops that you guys have to jump through, and they're not going to like disappear if you don't spend them. I will look at that again and follow up with you, but I believe that it is a continually appropriated fund as opposed to something that has a more limited appropriation.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
So in looking at this, we're dealing with at least, well, we have 8 line items here, 3 of which look very similar, but vary depending on location. So 8 competitions running almost simultaneously is going to be a lot of work.
Agreed.
So I mean, the good thing about this is that some of them are very distinct. One is, communications plan and strategy. That's going to be a very different audience than best management practices versus who's going to be doing the ocean acidification hypoxia monitoring. One suggestion that I might offer is, for the sake of consistency, and Jack and Karen, please correct me if this seems counter to the council intent, it may be useful to just package that and have that as a single competition. So you have the intertitle, the subtitle, and Yaquina Bay for, just put all of that into one RFP. That way you're dealing with sort of consistency in terms of processes, potential sensors, things along those lines. So that would reduce the number of RFPs that are actually out on the street. The thing that makes, of course, all of this tricky is that the competitive word. So it does need to be out there in the spirit of competition. So the RFP process is of course the one that I default to. I would strongly encourage a third-party option here for the OOST, because I know for us, and we've got within Sea Grant, we've got a really streamlined machine when it comes to RFPs. Running this many competitions all at once would be hard. So I would make that recommendation, streamlining the number of RFPs if possible. And then, of course, digging into the details as to what we had in the rules. What does that mean in terms of timing? Who's eligible? What indirect looks like? All of the nuts and bolts that all the people who are going to be looking at this are going to be really interested in. And then, of course, making sure that we're appropriately tapping into the council without, while at the same time navigating any potential conflict of interest. That's my initial read on this. And having just run through the RFP process with Stack, I'm cognizant of, Jack, what you said earlier in terms of timing, which is also why I asked the question about the biennium. Getting this done and determining what actually, are we running these all at the same time, or are there ones that absolutely need to run first? Because the RFP development process is not inconsequential. So I'll stop there.
Great. Excellent point and recommendations. Steve, Christina, have additional comments or questions, suggestions?
I just had a quick question about the use of the term third party. When you mean that, Shelby, is that somebody outside of either Sea Grant or DSL running an RFP process?
I think it's, Andrea, you would probably, if you've got the rule right in front of you, I think the third party is outside of the trust.
Yes, a third party would be outside of the trust, the way that it is, the way that we have defined it. And I guess it could be the Oregon Community Foundation, since you guys have set up an agreement with them, but it doesn't have to be. So it could be another entity of your choosing. You aren't limited to only having one agreement and one third party entity. So that is definitely something that you guys could explore as well.
So then my next question on that is, does that have to be a competitive process too? Can we just select a third party, or do we have to actually like hold proposals for, or accept proposals for people that might be eligible to do this type of process?
Christina, I think not unlike we worked with, we chose to work with Oregon Community Foundation and Institute for Natural Resources, INR. I think we can select those entities based on best fit and cost and timeline, et cetera. I don't think my recollection is that the rules don't limit us to having to have a competitive process for that.
And then one last follow-up question is, if we do that, then there are administrative fees associated with that. And I didn't quite understand, since I didn't have a close read of the bill, whether there are administrative costs built into those funding, or if those are the $1,060,000 is directly has to directly support the research costs for the projects.
So to speak to that a little bit, so the appropriation doesn't actually break it down like on like a line item in terms of budget. Within the creation of the OOST fund, DSL, or actually I believe it's any other state agency, in theory, if the OOST wanted to work with a different state agency. However, this is where things get complicated. The actual appropriation within House Bill 5006 appropriated the money to DSL. So I think that we would be the one that would need to be spending the money if, in theory, it was appropriated to ODF&W. You guys could have worked with them. I think that is there's flexibility within the way that the fund was set up, but I don't know that there was flexibility within the appropriation. I would need to consult a little bit more with DOJ in terms of that. But there is a built-in mechanism for whomever administers the funds to charge a nominal administrative fee. I believe it's 5%. There are definitely different fees when using a third-party administrator, and I don't recall what the administrative fee for the Oregon Community Foundation was in terms of that agreement for them soliciting and doing the fundraising and then being able to spend those outside funds. So I'm not sure what that would look like in terms of using the agreement that you guys already have.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Steve?
Thanks, Chair Anderson. I echo a lot of the mostly questions at this point, and shared many of the ones which were stated that have been stated already. I would say I definitely agree with Dr. Walker that third party seems to be the right way at this point, and that's just because of my understanding. Otherwise, from what I understand now, it seems like we would have to build that capacity at OOST, including a web portal, all of the bells and whistles that go with an RFP process. And I agree that it might be simpler to farm that out. And happy to continue to continue talking about that and support that in whatever way is best. On the actual list, on the actual 8 line items, I did have questions around one, eligibility. Are we thinking academic institutions for the research part and other entities for the, the last part speaks to a communications and outreach plan. It seems like the audiences for the RFPs are going to be different depending on the line item potentially. So there may be considerations about how we target dissemination of those. I also had question about whether or not there was potentially supplemental legislative language or appendicized legislative language that could help inform the description of each of these grants, purpose and need statement, things like that to better flesh out the outcomes we are seeking through the dispersing this money. And then some other questions at this point, but I think that's it. One last one, I guess, is looking at the dollar amounts and the potential scope of projects under each line item. It seems like these are one grant shots. I don't know if for example, the 300 for intertidal or subtidal monitoring could be, 5 grants of 50 to 60,000, or if we are looking for one entity to disperse the entire sum of money to, and whether or not we get to make that determination or whether there's rules that we have to abide by that dictate that. So those are just kind of some of the things that are rambling around in my head, but again, appreciate the discussion. Thanks to everybody who supported this legislation, and look forward to being helpful.
Thanks, Steve. Although I was not a member of the legislature, so I can't speak 100% to the legislative intent, but generally, when you see appropriation bills such as this, it doesn't necessarily get into the weeds as much as determining the number of grants. So that is, I believe, up to the OOS's discretion. It does, however, have the intent of what that money is used for. So that $300,000 needs to be used for that purpose. I believe that you guys could decide, yes, how to divvy that out in terms of merit of the project and the funding that's needed. Also, to one of your original points, I just want to put it out there that DSL does have all of the capabilities of another state agency in terms of like posting RFPs and doing like having a portal and a way to like receive things. So we do RFPs for other things. So you guys could certainly use our resources in order to do that. It would more be setting up, like creating them and then reviewing all of them and making sure that all the priorities were established, and then actually working with the receiver to make sure that they've met the obligations, because you guys are the experts and we wouldn't be the ones that would be able to do that. So the capacity would need to come just within setting up that process and ensuring that the intent of the awards is being fulfilled. And then once we, in theory, got the okay from you guys, we would be able to pay out grant funds to make sure that all the boxes were checked.
Thank you, Andrea. That's really helpful to know that DSL does have that web capability to do this if we do go decide that. Thanks.
Absolutely.
So I think I'm looking at kind of summarizing some of these questions into next steps. And it seems like the question of how to streamline and or prioritize for timing the 8 line items is really most appropriate for the OAH Council to provide direction on that item. Also, the ability to clarify eligibility and more of the kind of what the expected outcomes and needs are, and that the other immediate need of finding a third party to run or developing capacity for the OOST to do this would be something that would fall on the OOST. Let me just ask Representative Gomberg or Senator Anderson if you have any insight into any of the legislative intent concerns that were raised by the board, or if we have, if Andrea encapsulated that for us.
I'm going to defer to Senator Anderson to begin because I think there was more conversation in the Senate.
And I would, thank you, Representative. I would say, the discussion really has been to DSL and, seeing their oversight, their administrative staff, their ability to get the appropriate interpretations and direction. So I don't know that I can add anything, quite honestly. It's interesting to listen to the discussion, and our job now seems easy, getting the money, and now your tough job is getting it out. Jeez.
I'll just remind everybody a little bit about legislative process here. So the bill was introduced on the Senate side, had a policy hearing, and then sent to Ways and Means. And when Ways and Means decided to schedule it, it went to a subcommittee that was more interested in the money than it was in the policy. So by the time it came to full Ways and Means or to the House floor, the focus was on dollars rather than on policy. And so we didn't even have a policy meeting on the bill on the House side. The Senate, of course, got it straight out of Ways and Means as well. So congratulations, you got the money. We don't have a lot of insights as far as legislative intent. But I will also add that, Senator Roeblen worked on this for a long, long time. And I want to express gratitude to him for setting this up to reach the finish line. If you're looking at legislative intent, you may need to go back more than just through this one last awkward session.
Yeah, thank you for that. And when we close up our meeting this afternoon, we'll talk about wanting to reach out to Senator Roeblen and thank him for all of his hard work on this effort and finally seeing it come to fruition. All right. Well, that said, kind of getting back to the next steps, I outlined two. One being, I summarized two from our questions: streamlining and prioritizing and clarifying. The other being the third party selection and or capacity building. Jack and Karen, what other next steps would you see in terms of process that we might need to spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing or thinking about?
I'll jump in, and thanks for the discussion. I think the legislative intent, even though it may have been a little bit less at the forefront this session, has a good track record, and so we certainly can help piece that together from the last 15 years or so of discussion around this. And so Jack and I are ready to help with that. And so to your question, Laura, it seems like creating some kind of structure around the UST board members and the OAH Council to have a group that can tackle these issues together offline, so to speak, so that we can kind of work through some of these things and make some progress seems to make sense. Maybe that's part of your second line item of just third party and logistics, but to me it may be a distinct third item on your list. And
Karen, I would just add to that before you move on, that coordination piece, that is a distinct piece, and noting that we currently are lacking a board member. We'll talk about that at the close too, with Jim Sumich's resignation. And he was also our liaison to the OAH Council. So just recognizing that we have an opportunity to have a a key pivotal person there that can sit on both entities to help coordinate this this process.
Yeah, and of course we have Shelby, who coincidentally is on both, but she's not in the quote unquote OOST seat on the OAH Council, because we have both a seat for the for Sea Grant as well as for the OOST. So she's been playing a little bit of double duty since Jim tendered his resignation, as have you, for that matter. So I think that's a good third item. I wanted to just briefly agree with Shelby's point of thinking about how to package some of these items into an RFP. That makes a lot of sense. I think we can rapidly talk about which items should go first in terms of getting equipment in the water to document events that are frankly happening today, yesterday, tomorrow. As soon as we can get those out in the water, those will give us important information. So I think that's no problem either. So I think that the concerns, the questions that have been raised, to me, I feel like there's a path forward on all of those, and it's a matter of just getting down to business and getting it laid out. I also agree it's not my it's probably not my right to share this opinion, but I think for the first biennium of funds going to the OOST, that using a third party just makes so much sense to run those RFPs. And in the process of doing that, the OOST will learn a tremendous amount, no doubt, and it may be revealed that there is a path forward for the OOST being in charge of that RFP process in the future, but it'll take time to develop what that might look like, and some experience would inform that greatly. So I'll stop there.
We have so many strong partners on the call today, and I would love to open it up for any comments or feedback from our public audience partners on our process here at this point.
Laura, if I may, this is Jack. I just wanted to follow in from Karen's remarks. I think you have separated out the things that have to be done, and that part of developing the RFP, as Shelby said, going through that takes time. What I heard from Andrea is that DSL could do the rest of the process from there. Mm-hmm. The third part is the evaluation. I just want to point out on the evaluation side, there's lots of expertise on this, on these 20 boxes, plus the rest of the council. So I would encourage you to think about this committee of coordination that could be a subset of those groups that would be the evaluators. I would think that could be pulled off. So if DSL can do the process and you've got the evaluations, it's really developing the RFPs, which is, it is a big deal. But I'll just devil advocate for a minute. I'm not sure you necessarily need to go to a third party. I'm mostly worried about making best use of the funds out to the work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jack. And maybe I'm using third party too liberally. I was considering the DSL RFP pathway as part of that, but DSL is not exactly separate from OOST. We fall under DSL, so I don't know what the appropriate way to term that is. Andrea, looks like, did you have a response?
I didn't technically define third party in the rules. That is actually a definition that is absent. I just checked. But no, I view the OOST and DSL as a partnership. So if you guys are running the RFP process and we are just administering the funds, I don't necessarily believe that that would meet like a standard legal definition of using a third party.
Great. So if you want to, if any of the other folks on the call, you can type your name in the chat and I can call on you in order if you have anything to help contribute to this part of our agenda. And Gina, can you? Hi.
Hello. I just have one quick thought. First, I just want to say congratulations on the bill coming through and for UST having this opportunity. It's been years in the making and really wonderful, and just want to express gratitude to the legislature and everyone who worked on it for making it happen. And then I also just want to amplify Steve's point where he made the suggestion that, or brought to a question of, is this, you know, one award, like one big RFP with one big award, or sometimes, you know, doing this work through the right partner in the right place through smaller awards gets better results. And so I don't know when and how you'll tackle that, but I just think it's a really great question and want to just add that to the dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina. All right. I'm hearing a lot of people jumping up, but go ahead, and if you think of something, if you want to type your name in the chat, I can call back on you. We still have a little bit of time left in here. I heard pretty what I would call kind of a almost solid recommendation from Jack that sounded like this to me, which is that the UST could coordinate with DSL for doing the RFP process and then create a coordination committee is the word that I heard that would have presumably UST and OAH Council membership that would work on the packaging of the RFP as well as the evaluation piece. Jack, is that correct? Okay, I'm getting a thumbs up. Would anybody care to comment on that approach or offer any alternatives to that approach, support for or questions thereof?
Shelby has her hand up.
Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Shelby.
Yeah, Laura. So I think we need to not underestimate the process here. It is as Jack knows, what Stack went through was, you know, significant and unusual, but actually developing the RFP, you know, it took us 2 years. So actually probably longer for the Marine Reserves assessment. And I am concerned about trying to impose that on a largely volunteer group. So while I recognize that DSL has publication capacity, that's a very small piece of the actual process. So I would say that in terms of developing the RFP, the criteria against it proposals will be assessed, the evaluation process, and to respectfully disagree with my colleague, I don't think this group should be doing that. That requires a lot of time and dedicated effort. And just to be clear, I am not advocating for Sea Grant as a body to do this. I think a third party should be external. But I do think that we need to give some serious consideration as to the level of work that's involved in all of this. I think when we have the coordination body to understand what the priorities are, where things can move first, that will help quite a bit. You know, while I do agree that it would be great for all of this money to go to exactly what is written here, that's actually not going to happen because part of it's going to go to indirect anyway. I don't necessarily think that 5% is all that much of a cost to bear in order to have the process be done really well.
Shelby, do you have, I don't know why I'm thinking like with INR, they have been a really solid partner for us in the Marine Reserves process. Is that an option for this, in your opinion, or is there another entity that we should be thinking about?
I think that that would require some additional conversation. I'm not entirely sure INR is the most appropriate to do this. So I would need to think about that.
Laura, one of the
Yes.
things that is striking me through this conversation is that having been on the side of making grants and doing RFPs in the past, I completely agree with Shelby that it is a lot of work, and especially with the diverse types of projects that we will be funding. I was going to suggest that maybe one thing we might want to consider is really just a roll up our sleeves work session to lay out this process and to get some other people involved, as you know, from the Acidification Council, to be able to, you know, just have an opportunity to think about the best process and think about the prioritization. You know, do we do this sequentially, as was mentioned, find a couple of priorities out of that list that might be more ripe to go than others, and then start working on that. In terms of the ability to spend the funds, that would be something that I'm really interested in as well, because it's been my understanding that once that money is appropriated, it has to be spent within a biennium. But maybe there's some other rules that apply to this funding, because it might be considered spent if it's already in the trust account at DSL. So that is something that's really important, so that we can figure out the sequence and the timing and the level of effort that's going to be required to get that money out on the ground. So anyway, just I feel like I need a lot more information before I could make a recommendation for how we should move forward with it, and maybe a work session is the way to do it.
Thank you. And Steve?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I agree with Christina and Dr. Walker as well. I think a lot of next steps hinge on that question of how detailed are these RFPs, and you know, how much work is going to need to go into drafting them, vetting them, getting them out, you know, and then not to mention the whole secondary step of getting them out the door online and otherwise. But I think that the idea of a work session is good to go through some of these questions. I've seen, you know, the RFP for the Marine Reserves Assessment is a big document. It's got a lot in it. And I can understand why it took so long. It's very impressive. And that's not even for a huge sum of money. You know, I've seen also there's this, Gina might be able to speak to it more, but we're involved in TNC and Q are involved in this STORE program to support oyster aquaculture, and especially restorative oyster aquaculture on the West Coast. And that's a pretty big grant program, but the RFP is pretty small. It's just a couple pages. So I think that there's a lot of different ways this could go depending on how we determine what our priorities are. And I think a lot of those decisions will hang upon what that RFP looks like and how much work needs to go into it. So that's just a comment. The second thing I will say is that also to flag that a lot of the issue areas, for lack of a better word, covered by the 8 or several of the 8 line items are things that is a lot of work going on currently in terms of SAV ecosystem modeling, in terms of looking at impacts, you know, OA impacts on shellfish. There's work Northwest Fisheries Science Center, California Ocean Science Trust, Ocean Protection Council. There's a lot of funding going into these very, very same subjects. So we should also be cognizant of opportunities to leverage other research that's going on, and just be aware of the sphere of different types of research projects that are currently being conducted so that we can make the most out of the funds that we do have to spend. That's it. Thank you.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of support for one part of this, which is to have a coordination committee / work session as a next step. And I didn't expect we were going to solve our process here today, but I think we've done a good job of talking through what the key issues are and getting a sense of the scope and the magnitude of what we're undertaking here. We have some questions to answer about the timeline of fund expenditure, and it will give us an opportunity to also think through more about what entities might be partners for us in this, either as third party or otherwise. So does the OAH Council have a upcoming meeting already on the calendar?
Excellent segue. I had my hand raised just to that point, Laura. We do have a meeting next week, and this bill and the projects therein are on our agenda. So I invite you all to listen in if you would like to. And I think with Jack's agreement, I think having a very targeted discussion about prioritizing, having a suggested prioritization of the items in the boost bucket would be certainly something we could get done next week. Jack and I have, our own opinions about that as well. So we are ready to help with that part of it and join a coordination group. My recommendation there is that coordination group be small to begin with, and that it get expanded as the RFP process goes on to get to the evaluation period, where you want to have diversity of folks looking at proposals, not necessarily in getting the nuts and bolts together to get the proposals in the first place. So thanks.
Okay.
I definitely agree with all that. And I just want to add that other comment about should there be smaller awardees within one of the line items? I think it's a really important question. We could talk about that as well. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think it's probably incumbent on Jack and Karin as co-chairs of the OAH Council and myself as chair of this committee to coordinate a coordinating committee. Boy, does that sound like bureaucracy in action. So outside, we'll report back to this group and invite specific people. And if you specifically want to be part of that entity, let us know. You know how to get a hold of all of us, and we'll put it together and keep moving the ball forward and make sure that we spend this money and spend it well. So great conversation. Feeling pretty good about it. Any final concluding questions, comments, concerns, complaints? Otherwise, we can take a little break, refresh our coffees, and come back here in just about 10 minutes, and we'll resume with a presentation from Tom Calvanese.
I just wanted to say before we break that I think on behalf of the whole board that we really, really appreciate all the efforts that went into getting this funding, and now trying to think about the work that's ahead of us is actually very exciting. No matter how much work it is, it's very exciting to have funding to actually work with. So again, really appreciate all your efforts collectively over so many years to get here.
Absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people on this call put a lot of effort in for sure. So this is very good to see happening. All right. Well,
Thanks
I'm gonna
all.
duck momentarily, and I'll be back in a few. Great. Hopefully people are getting themselves back to their comfortable spots for the second half of our OOST meeting.
Laura, if I could chime in if people are back before Tom begins and just follow up with an answer to the budget question that was fielded. I was able to touch base with our budget analyst over the break. And I just want to clarify, so there is a continuous appropriation within the OOST fund. So the OOST funds will remain in the fund continuously, and that earns interest. DSL, however, has a limited spending appropriation. So we will just need to make sure that any unspent funds at the end of this biennium end up in our budget for next biennium as a subsequent appropriation, so that we have budget limitation to pay out those funds. So it's just another administrative process, and we will need to coordinate about what remains in the fund. But the funds will remain within the OOST funds, even if they are not spent within this biennium. So I want to be clear about that.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Let's see, another minute or so. I know that we have one of our board members, Christina, will be having to exit at 2 o'clock, as I understand. Richard Hildreth will as well, and otherwise, I think we're about here.
Tom, I just put it in the chat.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, I'll definitely.
Oh, that's
do
recent.
that
I
for
had
sure.
not seen that either.
Yeah, just a few days ago. Excellent. Well,
Right.
that'll be a good lead in for some of the things I'll be talking about.
Cool. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce to you, if you don't already know, which I would imagine most all of us do know, Tom Calvanese. So I think I first met Tom when he was giving a presentation of his fish tracker work. I don't know how long ago that was, Tom. I feel like it was at Hatfield, and you were giving a presentation of some acoustic telemetry work that you were doing in and around the Port Orford area with these various rockfish species and looking at their movement patterns and so forth. And I just thought it was the coolest thing. And also it was really cool that you were picking up sharks and other kinds of odd creatures that were cruising through the marine reserve and getting pingers and trackers on them. And I don't know, that was probably about 7 or 8 years ago. But my understanding is that you've really been in the Port Orford area and have been working in and around the Port Orford Marine Reserve for the whole 10 years that it's been in existence. And prior to that, you were a sea urchin diver, which in part funded part of your graduate studies through Oregon State University. And I would imagine there are a lot of other experiences aside from being a self-described fish nerd that has brought you to, that is your own self-description, I read that. That brought you to your position as the station manager for the Port Orford Field Station, which is now part of Oregon State University. So that's super exciting. And Port Orford's being such a very small town, I'm sure that you have your tentacles in almost everything going on there. So Tom's going to give us kind of an overview of 3 different and connected projects that are happening on the South Coast. And with that, I'll let you take it away, Tom.
Great, thanks. Great introduction, Laura. Yeah, indeed, I am a fish nerd, unapologetically, and more specifically, a major nerd when it comes to Pacific rockfish of the genus Sebastes. And in case you don't know, Sebastes is Greek for magnificent. And indeed they are, and I've been kind of obsessed with them since, and continue to be obsessed. And yeah, I remember meeting you then too, and back in the Fish Tracker, I have to call it Fish Tracker 1.0 now, because in a minute I'll tell you a little bit about the current iteration of that project. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to share 3 separate presentations with you. As you mentioned, these are all related. I'm going to be talking about the field station, about the Oregon Kelp Alliance, and about the Port of Port Orford. And yes, I have found myself with many tentacles touching on many things in Port Orford. And it's a small town, but there's a lot going on here. One of our major supporters likes to say that it's the little town that does science. And I love that she describes it that way, because it really is. And the community, because of a lot of hard work that's been done historically, in large part by a group of commercial fishermen that once comprised the Port Orford Ocean Resource Team, which I'm sure you know about. You know, they really set the stage and laid a foundation for a lot of the work that's happening now. So they deserve that recognition. And you'll see some of that work in a few minutes. So I will separate these out. I'm going to try to do a 10 or 12 minute presentation and then stop for questions so that we can hopefully get through this without taking up the rest of your afternoon. But yeah, they are all related, and you'll see some of those relationships. So I'm going to kick it off by talking about the field station, and I will share my screen if I can manage that. I was about to share that that article instead of my screen that I really want to share. Here we go. Okay, let me navigate around. Okay, so you guys picking up what I'm sending out?
Yeah, it looks great, Tom.
Great. So, so as you mentioned, the Porterford field station, and the little arrow there shows you where it is, for those who don't know. And there's the essentially the mission statement for the station that was developed by a working group several years ago. And it operates under the umbrella of the Marine Studies Initiative. And most of you, I think, are familiar with that initiative. This is what we sometimes call a hub, or one of the nodes of a network that's coastal or coast-wide. I like to affectionately call it the South Coast Outpost of the OSU and the Marine Studies Initiative. Okay, I don't want to go any further without mentioning the place where I am. And over my shoulder, you can probably see the rock you see in the picture that has a traditional name, which I'll probably butcher, but I've heard it said Manasaha, which means the place of gathering mussels. And that's how it was known by the people who were here when the settlers came to establish the town of Port Orford, the Tututni. And members of the Coquel and the Confederated Tribes of Kuzla, Warmkra, and Siuslaw continue to live here and work here. And I work with many tribal representatives in a lot of the work I do, and really appreciate that perspective on the place. So you may have seen this diagram that came out of a Marine Studies Initiative planning document. I like it because it really captures the essence of an initiative and a field station that's located in a place. And the reason for it being here is to study that place. And sometimes we say from the ridge to the reef. And you can see clear cuts in the hills around me. and of course the marine reserve just offshore and the reefs in the deep water below. So this really is the sort of a great way to capture some of the sort of the framework in terms of the work that we do here. And here's a photo of this station where you can almost imagine that diagram laid on top of the real world here. That's the Humbug Mountain. Many of those forests on the mountains above there are being clear cut right now. The marine reserve is just offshore. And we're really looking at this whole coastal ecosystem, and it's rich with opportunities for discovery and learning. Speak to what the station really is about, and it's a place in a place where you can learn and teach and study and research the place that it sits in. And here's just another shot of the field station that shows another aspect to it, which is how its proximity to the port of Port Orford. And I'll be talking more about what the port does, but the port is really essential to the work that we do here, because so much of the research that happens here is done on commercial fishing vessels. The field station is really the outgrowth of the establishment of the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve, which was established in January of 2012. And we're currently planning an event next year to acknowledge that 10 years of marine stewardship and protection. I'll speak a little bit about some of the work that's been done there, but the work that was done by the community to establish the Marine Reserve and working with ODFW to put it in place and implement it, then led directly to an appropriation to fund this field station, because the fishermen who were involved really were pretty insistent that we could set aside an area to protect life in the ocean, but we also had to commit to studying it. And that was what led to the field station and why it's here. Of course, it's done many more things, but that continues to be sort of a core part of the mission. And I cannot resist always sharing this iconic photo of a beautiful red, in fact, vermilion rockfish, one of the species that gave Redfish Rocks its name. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of generally the three areas of work that we support here at the field station: research, education, and community engagement. And there are lots of different things I could talk about. I'm going to touch on a few things here in terms of research. And first with one that's currently underway right now. The RV Langseth is running this series of transects that you see in the map. And that is to investigate Cascadia subduction zone using some fairly powerful seismic tools. One of those tools uses an air gun to generate very loud bursts of sound that can then be used to investigate the subduction zone more thoroughly. As you can see in the map, the little red triangle shows you where the marine reserve is. And you can see that the Langseth and the air guns passed very close to the marine reserve. And so that led to some interest in studying the potential behavioral responses of fish and crabs in the marine reserve. And so what we have in hand here is, well, Laura already talked about Fish Tracker 1.0, and this is sort of Fish Tracker 2.0. So working with Drs. Sarah Henkel, Scott Happel, and Taylor Chappell, we are basically repeating that work with a little more equipment, a little more, frankly, a little more funding. I'm not having to go urchin diving to help fund this project. And it's a really interesting investigation of these, the movement patterns of these species. So we have tagged 15 China rockfish, 15 black rockfish, 15 lingcod, and 15 Dungeness crab. And we're currently tracking their movements as that Langseth passes by, doing the seismic investigations and using very loud sounds to do so. So stay tuned. There'll be future cool presentations done by some or all of us when we find the results of that. And then, of course, the investigation of the Cascadia subduction zone is going to be, I think, really, really interesting. And it's going to tell us a lot more than we know right now about what's going on down there. Just going to touch on a few other projects that we've supported out of the field station. Of course, ODFW is responsible for monitoring the Marine Reserve, and that includes things like hook and line and long line surveys. They actually switched their methods from standard hook and line to a long line approach after working with a local commercial fisherman, Jeff Miles, who advised the agency. And to their credit, they heard what he had to say and they changed their technique, and the results improved. We look at juvenile fish recruitment. Unfortunately, this year we did not have the funding to do it at this site, but we've done that for about 8 straight years with lots of interesting results of what's going on in terms of juvenile settlement of little baby fish at the Marine Reserve. We use a device there that you see just on the surface. And here are some of those little rock stars, a tiger rockfish juvenile and a split nose rockfish. What we found is there's a lot of variability in recruitment of juvenile fish. You can have a lot of split nose one year and none the next. And that just leads to lots of interesting questions about recruitment and recruitment into the Marine Reserve. We've been supporting a gray whale foraging project led by Lee Torres at the Marine Mammal Institute, GEM Lab, for, I think we're going into our 7th year this year. This is a team led by a graduate student with 2 undergrad interns and either 1 or 2 high school interns. All those interns end up moving on to greater things after they participate in this really rigorous project. And we're finding all kinds of interesting things about the whale feeding behavior. Dr. Lee Torres and Dr. Aaron Galloway from OIMB are now conducting another project that emerged out of the Oregon Kelp Alliance called essentially Kelp to Whales. So we're really looking at the trophic dynamics that connect kelp forests to whales through the food that the whales consume. As you can see, swarms of mysid shrimp there around that kelp. And that's what the whales eat. And that's why the whales depend on the kelp forests as well. So that study is currently underway. And we work and support PISCO. And you may know about their work in intertidal ecology. And they were key in identifying the sea star wasting outbreak that occurred along the coast and continue to study marine diseases in the intertidal and beyond. And also partnering with the Hatchery Science Center to look at the Elk River hatchery output and the issue of straying of hatchery fish in interbreeding with the wild population. And a project underway right now to mitigate that straying or attempt to mitigate that straying using olfactory cues. Shifting now to talking a little bit about education. This is a class that we came to know as the Cascades to the Coast class, where we partnered with the Cascades campus of OSU to bring students down from the Bend campus and give them literally an immersive experience here in Port Orford. And here they are with a snorkel guide, Mike Barron, with South Coast Tours, and they're about to go out to Nellie's Cove, kayak out there, get in the water, get their faces in the water, and for many of them, it was their very first experience peering under the surface, and came back really inspired. And I think at least one of them has changed her major and is now a marine biology major. As I mentioned, we support a number of internships from high school to undergrad to graduate students. And speaking of which, the Marine Studies Initiative supports Marine Reserve communication interns for the last 2 years. In 2020, it was Tom McCambridge. And this year it's Maddie English. And Tom is there displaying a piece of camera gear that he helped rescue for the whale team. And Maddie is here. That picture was actually taken this morning while she was helping to install a pH sensor as part of an intertidal ocean acidification initiative led by Francis Chan. And we've been measuring pH at Rocky Point adjacent to the Marine Reserve since we started doing it. Working with the Coastal STEM Hub to reach students in middle school. We had a after-school science club here for a few years. We couldn't do it last year, but we hope to start that up again. And the young people really appreciate that opportunity to do real science in their own backyard. Another feature of this place is that there's lots of great habitat for scuba diving. So we support both scientific and recreational scuba divers, primarily by having a tank fill station that we were able to develop in partnership with Travel Oregon and other local partners. And that has actually turned out to be a really essential piece of infrastructure and is allowing us to do all kinds of interesting work. Here's just a gratuitous underwater shot for those who don't dive or haven't seen it lately. And another one that will lead into my next topic, where I'm going to be talking about the Oregon Kelp Alliance, some work we're doing on kelp and urchins. And a lot of research that we do is on commercial fishing vessels, and here's an example of that. And the pH monitoring that's been happening all this time was actually initiated by the Redfish Rocks community team. And here was one of the early iterations of that pH sensor being installed. And the community team outreach coordinator, Tara Ramsey, is just kicked off a BioBlitz along with partners up and down the coast that give people an opportunity to engage in some community science, learn about the life around them. And we've been working in partnership with the Portland Audubon Society to help train local volunteers to monitor black oyster catchers. And I just like this photo of black oyster catchers doing what you rarely see them do, which is walking on the beach. But there they were. And another aspect of our community engagement has to do with basically being roommates with Port Orford Sustainable Seafood. This is their processing facility, which is located right below me here at the field station, where they process seafood purchased directly from local fishermen, package and blast freeze it, and distribute it to a membership of about 500 through a community-supported fishery program. And I'll just mention, because it was mentioned by someone else earlier, that summer was really interesting because we managed to make our way through COVID all right, and still conducted a lot of great work and had students here doing things safely and doing a lot of good science. And then we had the fires come along and choke us with smoke, and yet we persevered. And the message here is one of resilience, I think. And I like this quote about volatile ocean and building better boats. And this is in fact a boat that's been built recently, a better boat. It was built by a local fisherman and collaborator, Joel Perkey. And the Alice Faye was the boat that we used to tag all of our fish and crabs for that Fish Tracker 2.0 project. So I always like to thank this community, this fishing community that works hard and understands the importance of understanding the ocean and the changes in it, and are always ready to collaborate and partner with us in the work that we do here. So with that, I'll ask you to follow us on the multiple channels, and I'll take questions if you have any on this section. And hopefully that wasn't too much of my time. I'm having trouble keeping track of the time here, Laura.
All right. Any questions for Tom at this point? We'll also have time, of course, at the end as well.
I have a question. Thank you for that presentation. That was excellent. I did diving off of Port Orford back in the day when I was at DEQ and looking for outfalls. So it wasn't quite as enjoyable as looking for all the rockfish out there. Anyway, you had talked about doing those acoustic studies and using air guns and looking at the impacts on some of the marine organisms there and fish, but were those tests done during the whale migration season, or and if so, was there consideration for the acoustic impacts on whales?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll admit that I am not sort of intimately involved in that aspect of the project that's occurring on the offshore vessel. But my understanding is they did take steps to mitigate the effect of those loud noises on whales. And I believe one thing they did was to gradually increase the volume. So they didn't just start at the highest volume, but instead sort of brought it up gradually to give the animals a chance to sort of move away from that sound that keeps getting louder. That's a very untechnical explanation, but it's the one I've been given by some of the collaborators. And as far as I know, they have not had any negative encounters with whales during the project. But it's a great question. And I believe the recent article that came out in Science did reference that. And I can certainly follow up with you with more detail if you like.
Thank you.
Sure.
Chair Anderson, I had a quick question too, if that's
Yeah,
okay.
go ahead,
Thank you.
Steve.
Thanks, thanks, Tom, for the presentation and great to see you again. Just a quick
Yeah.
question about the Rockfish recruitment survey. And you indicated that you do have a bit of a time series there, but we're not able to conduct the surveys this year. And so my
Correct.
questions are, is that a funding issue? Was that a COVID issue? And secondarily, my internet kind of blanked out too there when you were talking about it. I didn't get if that is that a trawl survey? Is there bongo nets, or is that a tow type with survey, or how is that survey conducted?
So briefly, I'll answer the first question first. So the hiccup occurred, because of both COVID and because of funding. Last year, because of COVID, we did have the funding, but we ran out of time figuring out the protocols. And by the time we were ready, we weren't able to turn the money into a contract at ODFW fast enough. Excuse me. So we missed that last year. And then this year we did apply for a grant working with Kristen Gorod Colbert. And we did submit a Waite Foundation proposal, but it did not get funded. So this year it was more of a funding issue. But I think it's a really important project. To answer the methods question, it's using Smurfs, which some people, if you don't know what that is, Smurf stands for Standardized Monitoring Unit for the Recruitment of Fishes, because marine biologists can't resist bad acronym puns. So we have these essentially sort of juvenile fish aggregation devices that are deployed inside and outside the marine reserve. And then a team of divers that go out every couple of weeks to retrieve those samples, bring them back to the lab, euthanize them, bring them back to the lab to measure and identify them to species if possible. And then we've done some other work on otoliths and microchemistry. But yeah, that's the method. And that's also done at another site up at Otter Rock. And that site is happening this year. We're sorry that it isn't happening here this year, but we'll be ready again to do it next year. You pointed out a part of it I'll just admit that it kind of bothers me, that these are the kinds of long-term monitoring projects that we really should commit to. And when you do something like that for 8 years or 9 years, and you're about to hit the year 10 and it falls through, it's just so frustrating, because now you don't have that nice time series that you were talking about. But things happen. We'll figure it out.
Great, thanks. And so that aggravating device, that Smurf device, that's what we were looking at in the image you showed?
Yeah, so it's basically, it's some plastic mesh that's meant to mimic, in essence, mimic the kelp canopy, which is where you would find a lot of these juveniles. And, that's going to tie right into what I'm about to talk about, because, fish need kelp too, especially the baby fish and the adults too. And it's something I'm super concerned about and looking forward to investigating that further, that relationship and the potential consequences of losing that very important juvenile fish habitat, especially for a lot of commercial species. So I'm going to shift gears now and start talking about kelp. So here's, I think, Laura, you kind of alluded to me having lots of tentacles, or sometimes people say wearing lots of hats. Here I'm going to put on my Oregon Kelp Alliance coordinator hat and mention that I have Oregon Sea Grant and Shelby Walker to thank for this hat, because it was Shelby who suggested that, maybe this Oregon Kelp Alliance thing could use a little help, and maybe you should submit a proposal to Sea Grant and see if you could get some help. So I did, and they did, and here we are. And I'll say a little bit about where this came from, but mostly of what I want to talk about is a project that's currently underway and kind of where we are with that. So the Oregon Kelp Alliance is this group I'm going to talk about. These three photos are sort of catching a few aspects of this work on the left, and these were all taken in Bull Kelp. It's just south of Mount Humbug, in an area that's got a lot of urchin barrens, and I'll show a photo later. The center photo is of Tom McCambridge freediving out at Marine Reserve when he first arrived to do his Marine Reserve communication internship. And the photo on the right is heavy density of urchins at Tichenor Cove nearby. And I have to move something around here, sorry. Okay, so broadly speaking, the Kelp Alliance is intended, its intention is to work, generally speaking, for healthy kelp forests, and that can mean a lot of different things. Right now, as I said, we're focusing a lot on kelp restoration and dealing with urchins, but we've talked a lot about kelp farming, mariculture, looking at partnering with the Alaka Alliance on this otter reintroduction question, partnering with PISCO and others on the Pycnopodia sea star wasting issue. So I won't read through this, but the interests are diverse, and they range from commercial to research to recreational and conservation, et cetera. And we work directly with several tribal representatives as well. So here's the sort of list of players. And as I mentioned earlier, Sea Grant has funded a program development grant that helped us get off the ground. The Oregon Wildlife Foundation has funded a pilot project being led by Oregon Sea Farms to cultivate urchin. And the Pew Charitable Trust has provided some money to support this pilot project that I'm going to be talking about. So thanks to all of them and to all of the people who are involved in this in any way. So what caught our attention, really, it began with Urchin Divers. This is the boat I used to work on, in fact. And on the left, you see a healthy harvest of red sea urchins from the Mach 1 out at Orford Reef. And on the right, this is Orford Reef, but Orford Reef hasn't produced a marketable urchin in several years now. And that is because of a loss of kelp, which is what the urchins eat and need to grow and produce marketable or healthy gonad or uni. So why did this happen? And many of you have probably heard this before, but doesn't hurt to sort of just quickly review this sort of perfect storm scenario where we have this warm blob of water offshore between 14 and 16, and that brings warm water near to shore, and the kelp doesn't do well in that warm, nutrient poor water. So there's hit number one. We mentioned already sea star wasting, which took out a major predator of sea urchins, the Pycnopodia or sunflower star, and here it is suffering from wasting disease. You may have heard many species have rebounded or recovered from sea star wasting, like the Pysaster, but the Pycnopodia has not, although recently divers have spotted a few here and there, so that's some hopeful news. And there's work being done right now to potentially cultivate them. Lots of conversations happening about this other predator on urchins. And then, of course, work done in Northern California that really revealed the extent and severity of this issue following that warm water, and then was published in 2019, study looking at loss of kelp forests in Northern California. And of course, here in Southern Oregon, we're looking south at a place that's very similar to where we are and thinking we may have a problem here too. And sure enough, we were starting to see that. So this is just a map showing some aerial kelp survey results. These were surveys that were done between 1990 and 2011. It's 2021, so we haven't done this in about 10 years, at least not a coast-wide survey. That's something that the Kelp Alliance is also hoping to do some work on that. The map, what you're seeing in the map are the darker brown is a place where the kelp survey saw kelp beds more years. So the darker, the more frequently the kelp was surveyed there. Orford Reef, Orford Heads, and at the Redfish Rocks Marine Reserve. And I'm going to be talking more about Nellie's Cove and Titchener Cove, which is sort of the focus of this work. So we've also surveyed urchins, and by we I should say ODFW and Urchin Divers, surveyed the urchin populations at Orford Reef and at Redfish Rocks. And these graphs are showing you some of the results of those surveys. Notice that the vertical axis is different. So the Orford Reef densities are much higher and pretty startling actually from 2019. That's a massive increase in purple urchin densities at Orford Reef, and even an increase in red urchin densities. At Redfish Rocks, not as high density, but an increase nonetheless. So worth paying attention to. So here's what Nellie's Cove looked like in 2017 during an eco tour by South Coast Tours. And then nearby Titchener Cove looked like this. I think I showed part of this picture earlier. So just a high density of purple sea urchins and no kelp to be found. Last fall, we managed to pull together a group of divers, scientific divers, AEUS divers, reef check divers that were trained to do survey work, and some sport divers and some recreational divers, all convened here in October to do the baseline survey work at Nellie's Cove that we agreed to do as part of a scientific take permit, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And here's our Eco Tour partner, South Coast Tours, and Captain Dave Lacey supporting some scientific divers that are getting ready to get in the water and do those part of those surveys. This is the map of the study area at Nellie's Cove, the kelp forest restoration area. I should note that this has been modified since I put this slideshow together. So the treatment and control areas are actually reversed. So don't let that legend throw you off. We are actually using the west side of the cove here on the left of the picture as the treatment area where we are starting to cull purple sea urchins to establish the conditions under which kelp could potentially recover, and that sort of is the experiment. You see the results here of the surveys showing very high densities of purple sea urchins and no kelp. And those were the ones that were completed in October by Reef Check. And yeah, so speaking of Reef Check, they just recently trained 7 more Oregon divers on their survey protocols and hired a part-time coordinator. And we're really excited about that. Having them as partners in this work is really important and is adding a lot of value to the project. So once we had started to talk about this project and starting it at Nellie's Cove, we very soon heard from divers up and down the coast that they were seeing similar situations where that's their sort of favorite dive site. And so we quickly expanded the project and added these other 4 sites, 2 of them on the North Coast at Cape Lookout and Haystack Rock in Pacific City, and 1 at South Cove at Cape Erego, and then Brookings at Macklin Cove. And I'm just going to give you a quick view of some of the maps of these areas, these experimental areas. So this is the Cape Lookout area. We will probably begin in a subset of this area. It's a pretty big area. The Haystack Rock area, which is in Pacific City, and this one was mostly identified by free divers. And this will probably be the next place that we survey. Cape Erego is an interesting story there at South Cove. And I'm sharing these photos so you can sort of see this sort of juxtaposition where you have these high purple urchin densities just adjacent to a pretty thick and healthy looking kelp forest, but reports that this area of urchins is increasing and perhaps doubling in 1 year. So that's something we want to pay attention to. And this is also a site where the Kelp to Whales project that Aaron Galloway is part of has already begun to do some surveys in this area. So we're collaborating on that and still intend to do some more surveys of this area, see if we can wrap our heads around what's going on there before we go any further. And this is the map of the South Cove area at Cape Erego. And I already showed you the Nellie's Cove map, and here's the one for Macklin Cove in Brookings. Again, an area identified by local divers as having the similar characteristics. Our scientific take permit with ODFW includes the baseline surveys that will be conducted prior to any interventions, any urchin culling work. And since Reef Check has done, unfortunately, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but they have already done surveys here at Macklin Cove and found similar high urchin densities and no kelp. So we expect to amend the permit and initiate some of the culling work at Macklin Cove as well. So I mentioned this already, that we're doing this under a scientific take permit that we worked with the ODFW, the Shellfish program, particularly Scott Groth and Steve Rumrell were instrumental in developing that permit. And this is being done using a basic, classic before-after control impact study design at these 5 sites with local coordinators. And what's included here in the survey, of course, are purple and red urchins, kelp, red and flat abalone, and sunflower sea stars. I haven't said much about abalone, but they compete with urchins for food. So we're really interested in how those abalone are doing, particularly in areas that look like this, where the urchin population is overwhelming and the abalone really don't have much of a chance of acquiring the food they need to survive. So we're very concerned about that too. This photo is taken from south of Mount Humbug. And as you can see, it's what we call spine to spine. It's just literally a carpet of purple urchins and there's no kelp in sight at that location. We're also monitoring reproductive status of the purple sea urchins. We're subsampling as we go through the removal part of the project and then bringing those back to the lab to do gonadal indexing to measure the reproductive status, and we'll do that over time to look at seasonality. And our Maddie English, our Marine Reserve science communication intern, is actually going to be working on that as part of her internship this year. We've also deployed dissolved oxygen sensors before and after the culling events in both the treatment and control area to just look for any potential issues around reduction in dissolved oxygen or temporary hypoxia. And thanks to Dr. Francis Chan for loaning us a couple of DO sensors that we can use for this project right now. So we kicked off this project last weekend on the 26th and 27th of June. We had about 12 divers. Rough estimate, we think we culled about 8,000 purple urchins, maybe more, during 6 shifts, 2-hour shifts of 4 to 6 divers each. So this map is just some preliminary results, just showing some of the number or density of urchins that were culled during those dives. And you're seeing lines, by scuba divers, and you're seeing circles that were done by free divers who worked in teams off of a point mooring, where the scuba divers worked off of a ground line that went between these 2 white triangles, and then used a transect tape to work from that line, either west or east. So there'll be lots more to say about that, but those are just some preliminary results. And again, we are now preparing to do this again this weekend. And this weekend, I think we have about 20 divers signed up. So there's lots of coordinating going on right now to get ready for this weekend. And here are what have now, I guess, become known as Kelp Forest Defenders. That was a local fisherman who donated some halibut from his fishing operation to the, as he called them, the Kelp Forest Defenders, to have fish tacos after their dive exploits last weekend, and made a point of talking about the reason he did that was, as a commercial fisherman, he recognizes the importance of the kelp forest to his livelihood and wanted to support the Oregon Kelp Alliance and the divers who are doing this work. So those are just a couple of shots from last weekend. The second from the left, on the left photo, is Diane Hollingshead, who's the new Oregon Reef Check coordinator. She's down in Monterey right now, getting some training. And the diver on the right is one of the free divers, local free diver. For free diving until a few years ago. Now he just does it for fun. And he was definitely having fun that day. So that's how I'm going to wrap up the Oregon Kelp Alliance part of the talk. You can find out more at OregonKelp.com. We have a mailing list. You can sign up for the mailing list to get news. Also follow on social media, Oregon Kelp, or at Oregon Kelp on either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. You can certainly reach out to me directly at my OSU email or by phone. That's my work mobile. So that's the stuff I have to say about the Oregon Kelp Alliance for now. I've mentioned some of the funders already, and anyone who's working on this issue. I think you're doing good work, and we support you and look forward to doing more work with you in the future. And if you haven't checked it out already, check out the OPB piece that was recently published by as part of their Superabundant series. And the last one was on urchins, sea urchins, and really focused on the culinary side of it, on uni. But also, I guess they sort of indulged me in having some conversations about kelp forest ecology, how the urchins fit into that. And I look forward to working with them in the future to flesh out that story a little bit more and talk more about some of this work that's being done. So I think that is what I have to cover from the Oregon Kelp Alliance side, and I'm happy to take questions about that.
Great. Tom, how are you feeling about time? We have about 23 minutes left, and I want to make sure you have enough time to complete your third part of your presentation as well. We could hold questions until the end if you prefer, or we could take some questions now.
We could do it either way. It would be good probably to at least get through the slides I have for the Port of Port Orford, and that one will probably go faster because it's more technical.
Why don't you go ahead and queue that one up, and then we'll hold questions until the end, because a lot of this stuff does indeed kind of merge and dovetail together in a very, very beautiful way, I would say.
Okay, so here I am actually able to take off one of my hats, as I just completed my second term as a port commissioner and as the chair of the redevelopment committee for the Port of Port Orford. As I told my colleagues, I'm stepping down but not away, as I'll continue to engage with the Port of Port Orford as a partner through OSU and also through the Oregon Kelp Alliance. So, but what I'd like to do here is I'm just going to walk you through sort of just sort of like some milestones in terms of the port's redevelopment initiative, how it sort of the path it's taken to get where it is now. And then I'll say a little bit about where it's at and what's about to happen. So for those of you unfamiliar, this is an aerial shot of the Port of Port Orford. And go forward. And I guess the take-home message really is that the Port of Port Orford really drives the local economy of the town. And here, I like this photo because it really shows you that connection that, about, on average, about $5 million in ex-vessel value seafood lands at this dock every year. And unfortunately for the local economy, a good portion of that gets put on a truck and shipped somewhere else. So, and it takes all that value along with it. So the port's initiative, its redevelopment initiative, is really focused a lot on this this question of how to capture more of that value and retain it within the local economy. And you saw one example of that already, because I showed you the Porterford Sustainable Seafood business that sits here within the field station, which ultimately will be located at the dock in the new facility. But that's one example, and we need more of those. So that's sort of like the essential message. And I'm going to break down some of the technical details. So this redevelopment initiative, it really is a 4-phase initiative. And the first phase was to address the failing breakwater. In the top photo, you can see a few years ago that breakwater break the water and leading to overtopping and just some pretty dangerous conditions. You can see the waves just overtopping the dock, in fact, at that point. And the photo below is just showing you the temporary repair of the breakwater. And that's another long part of the redevelopment process that the port's going to have to engage in to resolve that issue once and for all. But for now, the breakwater has been repaired. So this really started with looking at this old cannery building that was built, I think, back in the 1930s, and had really, as you can see in the photos, had pretty much like lived out its life, so to speak. Was still in use, but had become uninsurable and frankly pretty risky to be in. And I didn't even really like taking these photos, but such as it is. This was the need that was identified. And so there was a state appropriation to replace that building. It was not used and reduced to $250,000, and that money was used for planning and some additional funding from Ford Family Foundation, Wild Rivers Coast Alliance, and the Infrastructure Finance Authority to do some planning and coordination and to demolish the old building. The port then did a strategic plan update and identified that the replacement of that old building as a high priority, with the Economic Development Administration as a primary funding source. There were multiple community meetings and deliberations, and that's all included in this plan. As I mentioned to Laura, I will share the link to this presentation so that you can follow any of these links and go more into detail on any of these plan documents that you would be interested in finding out more about. A large part of this had to do with feasibility, geotechnical report. Looking at, as you could see from the view of the property, there's all kinds of geologic hazards to be dealt with, slope stability and soils and seismic hazards, tsunami and all of that. So that's all being taken seriously and incorporated into the planning. There were several community input meetings as part of this update. I won't read out all of these, but the community really engaged in wanting to have a lot to say to support about what this is going to end up looking like, and really focused on the importance of the commercial fisheries and the importance of access and engagement with the community and integration with the community and the town. Identified certainly the strengths in commercial fisheries and fisheries diversification, the access to the ocean for seawater, and saw lots of opportunity in specialty fisheries, mariculture, ecotourism, and research. So the port then engaged the services of an architect to do a preliminary design. Here's what they came up with. The message here was just that the goal was to create a facility that could house commercial fisheries operations that are focused a lot on live fisheries, also house research and education facilities, and house ocean recreation facilities. And there's a whole report that's got lots of detail in it you could look at. Then developed a market analysis, a market analysis feasibility study that includes a pro forma and some financial feasibility and tenant needs assessment. And that has all been used to develop, to continue to advance the development of the project. And then brought on board some project coordination capacity, identified some additional funding, and then prioritized as you see on this slide to the right, you see there's an entire document talking about port priorities, but it breaks down to a diversification initiative with commercial fishing at the center, but incorporating research, education, community engagement, and outdoor recreation as parts of that diversification of the economic portfolio at the port. So I've been saying this, but here it is visually. This is sort of the port's concept, is to integrate these initiatives, fishing, research, and recreation, and house all of these and support them appropriately. This is just another part of the process, developing this ALTA survey of the property that then is informing in the midst of this process, FEMA came along to provide some new maps that then informed the placement of the seafood hub, because some of these areas are buildable and some are not. Much of it is not buildable because it's in what's called a VE zone or velocity zone. Oops. Yeah, and I put all these clickable links in here, and now I'm clicking them. Sorry about that. So if I go back to. Okay. Am I back where I'm supposed to be? I think. How about now?
No, what we're seeing is the Kelp Alliance slideshow.
Okay, let me. I'm going to do it this way. My apologies.
No worries.
Reshare. How about now?
Yes, we see the site planning.
Okay, sorry about that. Too many different things I'm trying to share. Okay, I'll bring this home here. So the port then engaged with site planning agency Cameron McCarthy to develop the actual site plan with a series of focus groups from multiple stakeholders, and now has this finalized or contingent site plan showing where this facility will be located, along with a number of pedestrian amenities and other components to the project, including a new pump ashore seawater system and an ocean activity center. And right now is then demolished the old cannery building with the remainder of the state appropriation, completed a preliminary engineering report for an EDA proposal that's about to go in. And this is where I think I'll wrap it up. Has contracted for the services of a redevelopment, seafood hub redevelopment project manager that's focused on executing this plan, and now is about to, I believe, receive a $1.6 million appropriation in state dollars that'll be used for as matching funds for a roughly $7 million proposal to the EDA to fund the slope stability assessment and mitigation options, the building site analysis, and the pump ashore seawater system. So that will now be the next phase of this project. That'll be followed by the actual new facility, and then some other upgrades to the infrastructure of more of the commercial fisheries infrastructure, like the big cranes and the dock infrastructure. So sorry for the hiccups there on the sharing, but hopefully that gives you some sort of idea about what the port's been up to and where it's at now and what's about to happen. And I'll just leave this photo up as the money fishery in Port Orford, like it is on a lot of Oregon ports, is Dungeness crab.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for all three of those presentations. I don't know, for me personally, this is just really exciting to see how much is coming to fruition. These are long-term projects that have been going on for quite a while. I started working in Port Orford when the Ocean Resources team was founded back, I think, 1999. So that was about 22 years ago. And a lot of the things that we envisioned in those early days of the Port Orford Ocean Resources team, although that entity is sunsetted and doesn't exist anymore, is coming to happen through a lot of new entities and a lot of effort from yourself and from others. So it's really exciting and impressive. Do we have any questions for Tom? First from our board members, and then as always, I like to open it up to the general public after the members have had a chance to ask first. And again, just type your name in the chat if you'd like me to call on you. Yeah, Steve.
Thanks, Chair Anderson. Sorry, Shelby. Tom, two quick questions on the kelp slides. Thanks again for the presentation. One is, and maybe I'm daylighting some of my lack of awareness here, but I think most urchins are broadcast spawners. And so I'm wondering what that means relative to the culling program and how that impacts your decisions around timing and when that's done to make sure that we're not kicking off a spawning event or something like that. And then the second question is, with respect to the experiment, does your team or are you aware of other efforts on the kelp recovery front to for those index sites where you're or not the index sites, but the experiment sites where you're culling? Is it just removal of the oysters and then hoping that kelp spores kelp will regrow, or are there other supplemental efforts that you're aware of to help kind of jumpstart that kelp repopulation process, either through spores or anchoring or something like that? Just those are the two questions I had. Thanks again.
Yeah, they're both really good questions and definitely came up during the permitting and beyond. So I'll take the first one, the question about sort of inadvertent spawning. So there's two things about that. One is that the places that we're doing this work are essentially urchin barrens. And that means those urchins are essentially starving. They've eaten all the food that's available. And it's one of the reasons that we're subsampling the urchins and dissecting out the gonads and getting a gonadal index on them, so that we can look at what is their reproductive potential. And stay tuned on that. We're going to learn as we go, but we definitely don't want to create a bigger problem than the one we're solving, of course. So far, the folks that we've talked to that are doing this technique have not sort of experienced that problem. But that's the main reason that we're incorporating the gonadal index work into the project, so that we can watch that and look at, we're even considering doing some experiments, some lab experiments to sort of go deeper on that question. But those sort of two pieces to that. One is, for the most part, urchins that are in that sort of urchin barren state typically don't have very healthy gonads. And two, even if they do, we're going to take a look and make sure we're paying attention to what's going on there, and do that as we go, so that we can get into this question of seasonality. When is the best time to do this? I know from my experience as an urchin diver that typically summer is when you don't get good uni, because they typically would spawn in the spring. So doing it in the summertime is a pretty safe bet. But as we go forward, we're going to definitely be measuring that. Your other question about sort of supplemental kelp recruitment, I'll call it, is something we're also thinking about. Right now, we're trying to wrap our heads around this culling project, but already thinking about partnering with, there's some folks at Moss Landing Marine Lab that are experimenting with spore bags and things called green gravel, where you sort of have this gravel substrate that can be impregnated with kelp spores and then used to sort of seed the area. We don't have any concrete plans to do that yet, but definitely talking about it and thinking about that as sort of a next piece of the, sort of next phase of this project. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Great, thank you, Tom.
You're welcome.
Hey, Tom, thank you so much for the presentations. You and I have talked quite a bit about what's going on in Port Orford, but it's amazing to see the sort of the visuals behind it all. I did have one question with respect to the sort of the capacity of the field station. There's clearly a lot going on. How subscribed is the field station? Are you maxed out in terms of space? Does it vary through the year?
Yeah, great question. I guess I should. Okay, I'll unpack that a little bit. So, is it being used? Yes. Pretty much. I think sometimes we think of the field season as occurring, in this sort of narrow time window, but really, we started to have folks come here, on a typical year, I should say, can usually start as early as March. As soon as the winter storms have sort of subsided, there's work to be done and people want to come here and use the field station to support their work, whether it be using the lab or just lodging or using the classroom space for meetings and stuff like that. And just the ability to facilitate a lot of work. And then it goes until, we kind of get shut down by winter storms. It doesn't happen until usually October. So that field season that we think about, my experience here has been, it really extends from back in March, sometimes even February, all the way forward through October into November even sometimes. So I think it's being used a lot. You could always do more, but there is a capacity question in terms of just like what we have the capacity to support. I do think it's something that I'm working on right now because, as you know, some of the people might not know that I'm the only employee here at the field station. So it's a lot for one person to hold down and keep moving, even with intern support and whatnot. So that's something that I think is going to need to be addressed in order to take advantage of the untapped opportunity that just is part of the equation if you only have so many hours in a day to make things happen. In terms of the facility itself, I think again that we are bumping up against capacity at this point. We are planning right now to have a class here with Taylor Chapel to do some shark tagging in October. We hope to have a class of about 12 students, and that will be kind of pushing the limits of our capacity here in terms of lodging and facilities. So I anticipate that the facility, in order to keep pace with demand, is going to need to expand. And I should mention that the piece I did not mention where these things are connected, maybe I threw it off a little bit, but the port project will include the expansion of the field station facilities into a research and teaching lab down at the dock. So that'll be an expansion of the facility that will have an effect on this. And I'm saying all this as if it's fact, but know this, that I am not the one that gets to make those decisions. That's all subject, the caveat is all subject to funding and leadership decisions and such. But that's the path we're on. And I think it's an exciting one. And I'm looking forward to seeing it grow and continue to just do more. And it's really, to me, it's really exciting stuff.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Any other questions for Tom? We are incredibly on schedule today.
All right.
Good job, everybody. Right, well, thank you again, Tom. I look forward to continuing to attend the Kelp Alliance meetings as I'm able to. You have a really strong group of people from federal, state, conservation, academia. I mean, everybody's there at the table with you, which is pretty amazing for the little town of Port Orford. But what a great resource for the state of Oregon, for science, for the ocean. And thanks for coordinating a lot of these efforts and communicating it with us today. Do you have any questions for us or any closing comments you'd like to end with?
Well, I think I really covered a lot. And I really appreciate all the time that you gave me to do that. I guess I'll just close with the thing I started with, which was, even though I sort of broke these things into these bite-sized pieces, they really, for me, they're all of one thing, which is this place that, as you pointed out, a community that really took on some hard questions about ocean science and fisheries and marine reserves and changing oceans, and they built a foundation. And now we can build on that foundation. And that's what I'm trying to do, is to bring resources to bear in a situation like that I think really that's kind of a gift for us, because we didn't have to lay that foundation. It was there for us. And I think that's worth acknowledging and building on. And I guess the thing that I would like to do, it's not really a question, but maybe just something that I would like everyone to think about, is this question of connectivity and what we can do as a group to engage in strengthening the connections between, in this case, what's going on here on the South Coast and what's happening, let's say, in Newport or some of the other sort of other hubs. And that's the thing that I'm always looking for, opportunities to strengthen the spokes in that wheel, if you will, or those connections. And this is one great way to do it. I really appreciate the opportunity. And like I said, I'll share the links to those presentations so you can share them with everyone in case anyone wants to go down any of those rabbit holes. There's lots of links in there. I think right now I'm feeling like this port redevelopment project is going to be the biggest public infrastructure project to happen in this community probably ever. And my intention, as I step down but not away from my work as a port commissioner, is to really invest in that as a way to invest in the future of a community like this that has decided to retain its character as a fishing community, but is also looking at an uncertain future and trying to figure out the best way forward. And they recognize, in my experience, the importance of science, research, engagement, partnerships, and they're ready. So, I think we have some great willing partners. I think if we can just invest in that, in strengthening those partnerships, then we could see a fisheries of 2040 in a town like Port Orford that's viable and sustainable and continues to basically result in a thriving fishing community that's doing other things as well and making its local economy stronger as a result. And of course, also practicing good stewardship in terms of ocean stewardship. So I think we got this fantastic opportunity to execute a lot of the ideas that we talk a lot about. And here's an opportunity to pilot a lot of that stuff. And that really excites me right now.
Yeah.
So thanks again. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you guys get back to your business.
All right. Joe, is your comment or question for Tom, or is it public comment?
I guess it's Tom. It's based off of Tom, but
Okay.
I can wait till public comment if there's a specific period for that.
I think we have somewhat of an obligation to adhere as closely as we can to our schedule for public comment, just from a diligence agenda standpoint. So, are there any people who want to have public comment time? If so, you can type your name in the chat and I'll call on you for public comment. Otherwise, we can resume our Q&A with Tom and we can take Joe's questions. So seeing nothing at this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask you, Joe, to just introduce yourself briefly and then go ahead with your question.
Sure. My name is Joe Liebes. I'm with Portland Audubon. Yeah, and it's really just kind of a comment question. I'd love to hear Tom wax poetic on what I have to say, and maybe others. But first of all, I want to thank Tom for the presentations, the 3-in-1. And this is more towards the Kelp presentation. And I just wanted to, and I haven't been to these meetings lately, so maybe you have covered the rocky habitat process in a previous meeting, but I just wanted to draw a tie-in with the work that Tom and the Kelp Alliance are involved in with the urchin/kelp issue. Really is has a strict tie-in with the rocky habitat process. And for those of you on the call that may not be familiar with it, Chapter 3 of the Territorial Sea Plan is being updated, which is this, the section on managing our rocky habitats intertidally and subtidally. And there are several people on this call that are joining that were highly involved, including Tom himself on the work group. And I first want to thank the working group for all the work they've done to move this process along, and it's still in play. But part of that process was involving the public and inviting them to submit proposals to, in many cases, to provide, to recommend stronger protections or management or non-management recommendations to uplift sites. And one of the themes that came out of that and the Rocky Habitat Work Group identified was the kelp issue. So the public is totally aware of that, and some of the sites that were nominated, including up at Cape Lookout, where one of Tom's sites is, was a site that identified kelp as an issue. And so I think, getting to Tom's comment of how connectivity is so important, I think that's one mechanism that this Rocky Habitat public proposal process can do, and it is doing, and it will do in the future, hopefully, is make these connections for these types of issues that are emerging that need to be addressed by science and by other ways across our coast. Another one that came up is wildlife disturbance, which as more and more people come to their coast to enjoy it, there's more and more potential negative impact on wildlife, in particular, things like nesting birds that us at Audubon are concerned about. And I guess what this boils down to is I'm really excited that there's money now in the Ocean Science Trust. And it seems to me that that's money is now focused mostly on ocean acidification work, which is great. But I think this rocky habitat process is showing us that there are many other issues related to that and others, like wildlife disturbance, that I'm hoping in the future there'll be more money in the Ocean Science Trust and potentially other ways that can be directed to some of these issues that we are seeing to be very important on the coast, coast-wide. And so that's it. That's all I really have to say. And I just want to, again, thank the working group and Tom, who was part of that. And I would love to hear, since Tom worked internally in that group and knows a lot of what I'm talking about, I wonder, Tom, if you have any thoughts on that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Joe. I appreciate that. I guess I'll just zero in on the the whole kelp forest question. And you might have noticed that I'm tending to use the term kelp forest more. And the reason for that is because in this work, what's become abundantly clear is that it's not just about the kelp. I mean, the kelp is a foundation species, as we all know. It has all these, ecosystem services and habitat creation and all of that, but it really is, it's really an ecosystem that we're talking about versus a species. And I think, Joe, you pointed out something that I'll just, echo what you said, which is that there was definitely a theme through that rocky habitat process where many community groups came forward and said they recognized the importance of kelp forests to the health of and to put a sharper point on that, I think it's something that would really I'm thinking about it a lot, and I think it's something it's worth all of us sort of thinking more about. And that is that in that territorial sea plan, in the ODFW, the conservation plan. So we have all these documents and they reference rocky habitat or rocky reef habitat, or they sort of, not sure how to put this best, but there's sort of this equivalence between rocky habitat and kelp forest habitat. And what we're experiencing now is that you can have rocky habitat that is not kelp forest habitat. If the kelp is lost, you are no longer talking about the same thing. And that's something that I think would be worth our time to spend a little time looking deeper into that, looking at the conservation plans or the conservation strategy document, I think it is, at ODFW, where the kelp is called out as a strategy species, but the rocky habitat is called out as a habitat, but we don't really go all the way to the conclusion, which is to talk about kelp forest habitat. So I think that's something we could do some work on. And it ties directly into what Joe just said about one of the themes that emerged from that community process around the rocky habitat was, I think, a way of acknowledging what I just said, that the kelp forest is the thing that we really want to make sure we don't miss in the conversations about rocky habitat. I think that's partly a function of having emerged out of what we called rocky shores, and there's a lot of focus on intertidal ecology, which is great, and totally need to do that. But this process for me was a lot about extending that thinking into the subtidal area, and specifically one of the things that emerged from that was this conversation about kelp forest habitat. And then in the context of changes in the ocean and particular areas where we're seeing these problems, it just became even more sort of urgent or more pressing. So, what we're hoping is that we can advance some work around surveys so that we can really get some up-to-date information on the extent of this issue, what is really going on the Oregon coast, because there are places where it doesn't seem to be an issue and others where it does. So there's this sort of patchiness that we are trying to navigate through and figure out what it all means. But I don't want us to forget that change, typically ecological change, typically does not occur like that. It's a process. So we may be looking at the change, we may be experiencing it, be right in the middle of it, and have a hard time wrapping our heads around what's really going on because it looks one way over here and a different way over here. So I think the survey work will be essential. What we're hoping, and I'll just mention something I forgot to mention, I'm working with Sarah Gravem. Dr. Sarah Gravem and I submitted a proposal to Sea Grant to continue this project for another couple of years and introduce some additional scientific questions to it. Some of the stuff Steve was asking about outplanting kelp and things like that. So in the end, I think what we're hoping is to develop a best practices tool for kelp restoration in areas that we are able to identify by stepping up our survey and monitoring and efforts. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, Joe. Thanks for the pitch. And thanks for the extra time. Hope I didn't take up too much.
All right, Tom, it's good stuff. Thank you. I do think we'll be able to adjourn on time. We have a few minutes left. I have a couple of updates. One of which is that I was talking with the chair of the Territorial Seed Plan Working Group for Rocky Habitat Management, Charlie Plyben, recently about presenting to this group at our fall meeting. So that would be a good opportunity for us to get up to speed on what's happening with the Rocky Habitat Management and the Oregon Territorial Sea Plan. Also, for our next meeting, I have invited Congresswoman Bonamici's staff to present to us about some of the federal efforts that are underway that might be able to direct funding dollars towards ocean science in Oregon, and how we could position ourselves to assist in bringing those funds to the coast. That would include talking about the Coast Research Act, and which I believe, according to Allie, could double NOAA's budget for ocean acidification. There's also an initiative called Blue Carbon for the Planet to map, protect, and restore blue carbon ecosystems, and an estimated $10 billion for coastal restoration resilience in jobs, which is part of the jobs plan infrastructure funding package. And they're also looking to move just a general that's part of a larger ocean package for 2021. That includes a lot of things that we're involved in. So I did establish a line of communication there. We're going to have some regular check-ins with her staff, and they will present at our fall meeting. Shelby, I was hoping you could give us a 2-minute update on how things are with the RFP Marine Reserves assessment process.
Sure, happy to. I actually had a check-in with INR yesterday briefly, and then just sent an update to STAC today. So the RFP was issued. We sent it around broadly. As a result of that, we got one proposal in. I was grateful that we got one in. It was distributed to a subset of reviewers that STAC had previously identified, so it's in their hands now. We anticipate that we'll be convening the reviewers for a panel-like discussion, likely in August sometime, kind of depends on schedules. At which point STAC will reconvene to hear the recommendation coming from INR. After that, we need to come back to this body to provide the recommendation from STAC to OOST. And then it will be in the OOST hand to provide the recommendation to OCF. So we do want to see if we can keep things moving forward expediently. Laura, I think it may be worth a brief conversation as to how OOST might want to act on the recommendation if we're hoping to get things moving forward sometime in September.
Sure, and we can convene a special meeting of this group as long as we have public notice, because we won't be scheduled to meet again until October. So I guess this is a heads up for board members that we'll probably be convening, if a brief but special meeting to be able to facilitate that process.
Great, thank you.
All right. The other notable item is that we do have a board vacancy, and I have not been overly active in recruiting for that, and that's just a function of managing some of my other things. I will talk with Andy Lanier about getting that announcement up and I know Andy's on this call hiding back there somewhere, we can get that announcement up on the website and get it out more broadly. But if you have any recommendations or want to share that, this is a good time to do so. I don't have anything else really to report on that.
Laura, I think
Yes.
Steve, do you have a question?
Yes, Steve.
Yeah, I actually had a question for you, Dr. Walker, and then a quick response to Laura. On the RFP, is there a closing date to it? Is it open until a selection is made? And all that is to ask, do you expect any other applicants to submit, or is this, are we, where?
This is it.
This is it, okay.
Let's see, the proposals were due June 11th. So
Gotcha.
finite date.
Okay, so understood, thank you. And then Chair Anderson, on the board seats, my understanding is that there's not dedicated constituencies for each of the seats. So are there, with that in mind, should we be thinking about what type of representation we'd like to see, or what maybe we don't have that we would like to have? Is that kind of the discussion you'd like to have, or is there established criteria for where that board seat needs to come from, or what constituency they might represent?
Yeah, that's a great comment, Steve. We do not have to assign that seat to any specific type of individual. There probably would be a good opportunity to discuss what kind of person would best complement our cohort of folks. Jim Sumich was a retired professor from Oregon State University with a specific specialty in marine mammals. So there was a strong scientific core that he brought to our conversations and to our process, particularly as we were building our principles initially. I also have thought about where we are right now, and I'm really looking at the federal government funding opportunities as a particular niche for UST, so that we can be in a position to help bring more dollars to the state, as opposed to be in a competing kind of a situation for dollars with other entities that are already working in this realm. So I'd be particularly interested to see candidates who have some experience in or connections to federal funding, projects, pathways, programs, people, etc. But I would say, let's make sure we have this conversation on the agenda for the next meeting. And if there are individuals that we can reach out to in the meantime, I'd be happy to help facilitate that.
Thank you.
That concludes our agenda. Are there any other member updates or other business to discuss? And if not, we can adjourn this meeting. All right, very good.
Great.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time this afternoon. Our next scheduled meeting will be for October 6th. Wednesday in October is October 6th. I have a feeling we will be calling a special meeting previous to that, where we can queue up some of our more pressing and urgent issues. Thank you, Lonnie and Andrea and Ted, for helping facilitate our meetings. Thank you, Senator Anderson, for joining us today. Oh, and I am going to be sending around another card, this one for Senator Roblin. We used an e-card last month as members to send a thank you to Jim Sumich, who resigned the committee, and we will probably for ease use that same format to send our thanks to Senator Roblin for his work and queuing us up for success finally in getting our funding, kicking off our funding. All right. Great. Well, that's all I got. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.